Welcome to the HerStory Circle podcast, the podcast that brings you the extraordinary tales of everyday women who are changing the world. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Every week, we dive into the lives, challenges, and triumphs of women from all four corners of the globe. We're here to inspire, enlighten, and connect, sharing stories that uplift and empower. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and join us as we explore the incredible journeys of women shaping our future. This is Her Story, where every woman's voice matters. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Her Story Circle. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another intriguing woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Hello, listeners, and thank you, Gertrude, for the warm invitation. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are on. I'm getting to you from Naarm and here in Melbourne. My name is Pillay, and I would like to formally acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and pay my respects to elders past and present and tuning in. I am the CEO of a company called Mind Tribes and a social enterprise for culturally diverse women. I am a specialist in gender, race, ethnicity, social class, and age, and a practitioner in the space, specifically looking at exclusion and gender-based exclusion and race-based exclusion in workplace systems. So that's what we do. That's what I do every day. The reason why I'm focusing on it, especially in Australia, is that the racial literacy is quite low and social cohesion quite low, even though we have about 51.5% of the Australian population as first and second generation migrants. And being a migrant myself, I was born in South Africa and was born into racially segregated South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and that meant that all we knew was race-based discrimination and racism that was constitutional. So if you can imagine growing up with four races that were legally separated into geographical regions, so we had the Group Areas Act, it meant that we couldn't mix as races, and also there was advantage to the white race and severe disadvantage to Black South Africans, and of course Indians and Coloureds were sort of second-class citizens in that space as well. So a lot of eradication of culture, language, stories. We didn't have access to parks or recreation facilities, to sporting facilities, to the beaches itself. So we had the Parks and Recreations Act, we had segregated schools, and a lot of that, understanding of what it meant to live in segregation only came as I grew up and understood that inequity for what it was. And that would probably have been my earliest memories, maybe high school and trying to get into university and realizing that even our universities were segregated as well. So I spent my first couple of years of university in a segregated university, and then post the 1994 elections, first democratic elections, where Nelson Mandela was released in 1992, and the government turned to a Black empowered government, we saw that freedom of relinquishing of the strict racial divides. And even though those universities were open to us, and I went on to study at the University of Natal, it still was segregated in collective and social norms. So even though we had a Black empowered government by a brilliant leader like Nelson Mandela, norms and ways of connecting and community was very much segregated. And because of financial inequity and class, even though we could now buy in a white area and live in a white area, we couldn't actually financially afford it. So that became a big barrier in terms of class inequity, financial inequity. And it's still 30 years on from a democracy, is still not a country that's healed. So I am here in Australia 22 years, and that understanding of system inequity has stayed with me for a long time. And while I joined and came into the workplace as on a skilled migrant visa, and did another master's in Australia, and joined as a people and culture executive in firms here, I still felt the sense of equity work wasn't being done the way we should. We weren't seeing people of color or people from vulnerable backgrounds being treated fairly in employment, in recruitment and selection, and neither in development and promotion. And it became something that I felt I needed to address because of the knowledge and the lived experience that I had in South Africa. So when I started working as a people and culture lead in South Africa, we started with affirmative action, and we started with seeing a workplace as a social determinant of change, and we could give someone a job, we could change a generation of inequity, and so to made families stronger, made people thrive through learning and skills acquisition. So we just saw the transformation in workplaces, and I just wasn't seeing it here. And despite not having racial segregation legal in Australia, we still find that 1 in 5 people experience racism pretty regularly in society. And the number, 2/3 of people in workplaces who are people of color actually experience racism quite regularly in a workplace setting. And we are seeing in the context of what's happening in the US and what's happening here locally in Australia, we are seeing a rise in racial profiling and stereotyping, and a rise in racial vilification. So it's not as if it's not happening here. In fact, it is. The heat has turned up on racism, and we're expecting to face into that. We have our first anti-racism national framework in Australia, which brings some governance, but of course, we need to apply that into systems and policies and ways of working and institutional change that is I haven't seen in the last 22 years. So a lot of the work that we do as entrepreneurs in this space has been inaugural. Every single client we've had, private and public sector, large listed companies, have worked with us in their inaugural anti-racism work. So it's not something that they go to naturally. A lot of the progress has been on gender equality, but really not enough on anti-racism work. So it's racial literacy is pretty low. So even saying the word racism is quite difficult in workplaces. So it's been a battle, hard fought, and somewhat won, I can say. It's been 14 years of being a social entrepreneur. And if you look on our website, mindtribes.com.au, you can see the amazing clients that we've had the privilege of working with. But I can say honestly on this podcast that the cost of sales to be able to win a client like a large mining or large telco or large bank often takes about 18 months or more to convince the board, the executive team, the CEO to take on this work because it's often inaugural and people are quite fearful of addressing it, even though there might have been some First Nations work done before us. So we are non-Indigenous anti-racism specialists, but it's been a wild ride, and I hope that everyone listening actually has a quick contemporary view of what's happening in the anti-racism space here in Australia. But it's really fueled from my lived experience of seeing Black people marginalized severely, and looking at my own family and generations before me who suffered under the very harsh apartheid laws that we grew up with. So I might stop there and invite Gertrude back in. Questions for me?
Thank you so much. Wow. Your lived experience in apartheid South Africa has really prepared you for the role that you're playing now. I grew up in apartheid Rhodesia before Zimbabwe had independence. Blacks and whites didn't mix. I lived in South Africa before independence as well, and I was there during the transition with the Nelson Mandela era. And it's fascinating that now we're on the other side of the world.
Mm.
People of color still have these experiences. Now, I know that you talk about behaviorally solving for exclusion.
Mhm.
You unpack what that means in the real world terms and how it leads to measurable change.
Awesome question. Thank you. My training is in behavioral psychology and behavioral science. So a lot of what we try and unpack with the client is that cognition, that rational thinking, and we go with very much a lived experience lens. We look at risk, personal risk and organizational risk, and decision making. So we put the power back into that leader or decision maker's hands to understand the risk of not doing something. So if we present a story, a lived experience story of someone experiencing racism, both at the system lens, but also at the collective team lens, and then also interpersonally, one to one, because most people sort of only see the interpersonal view of racism and one-to-one racism. They just think, oh, this is someone making an untoward comment, race-based comment based on someone's visual appearance or someone's accent or someone's background. And that's what people spend a lot of time working at. And unfortunately, I find that quite ineffective because we're going back to that unconscious bias sort of training view of the world, where if we just train enough people to understand their own racial bias, then they will reduce that bias or eliminate that bias the next time they're hiring or the next time they're promoting, which we know that actually that doesn't happen very normatively in human behavior. Actually, what we say to people very clearly is from a behavioral perspective. Racial microaggressions or small sort of comments about someone's background or skin color or hair type is probably likely unconscious, that people don't mean to do that directly. However, conscious racial bias happens absolutely with racial stereotyping for what you know of the world and Black people, Asian people, for example, brown people, that you already have a predetermined rational thinking, conscious racial stereotyping about people from this background, and you likely see very rationally that there's a deficit or risk model from hiring or promoting a person of color to a portfolio under your leadership. So it's not as if it's unconscious, it's actually very conscious decision making in people processes. So what we do when we look at behaviors, we look at all the micro behaviors that someone has within that life cycle of making a people decision, either choosing to negatively or positively bias one or the other. And when we unpack that, we can actually see that people will understand their own behaviors and micro decisions that they're making, and understand that it's actually pretty conscious, and they can actually address it. If we don't unpack it like that, people feel that actually they're not racist, so they declare that they're not racist, and will say that they would never say something untoward about someone's skin color or hair type. And then usually organizations believe that, oh, we don't have racism doesn't exist here, when actually a lot of it is inherent structural racism, and it's built into ways of working and ways that people make decisions about who they hire and who they promote. So we unpack that, and when we unpack that behaviorally, people understand it and then can address it. But yeah, I feel like it requires a little bit of a journey of unpacking that. If you don't, people kind of dismiss it as, oh, but we don't have any reports of racism, and we don't. People here are pretty kind, they wouldn't say something like that, and because they're only dealing with those racial slurs and things that are pretty overt, but often it's very covert or microaggressive. Yeah.
Now, many of your initiatives address the intersection of gender, culture, and career life stage.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it necessary to take an intersectional approach in diversity work?
Because I feel like you just will leave people behind. If you don't take an intersectional view, and we can see that with the gender equality movement here in Australia, when you look at any metric you can find, whether it's looking at numbers of women on boards or women in the executive leadership level, the numbers don't lie. We have still a minority or no women of color, no women with a disability, noted disability, visible or invisible, no women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So the women that are there are the women that are very similar to the existing men who have been in power for generations. So we do note that if you actually take a very narrow view or a homogenizing view of gender, you miss the marginalization, you miss the intersecting differences that causes compounding marginalization. And we see that from a community lens. Like, we actually can understand, even in Victoria here, that if you choose a postcode in Victoria, you can actually understand the living conditions, well-being, health conditions of a community. And those people, when you look at work conditions, they are vulnerable, lower paid, they are not in leadership positions. So it tells a story that is often missing, and you have to take an intersectional approach. Otherwise, you pretty much will leave a large percentage of that population behind.
Now, as a woman of color in leadership, what have been some of the biggest personal or professional challenges that you faced, and how did you navigate them?
Ooh, where to start? There's lots of personal and professional challenges. Like, just to give you a window into my world, I pretty much, for the last 14 years, have spent an inordinate amount of time convincing and influencing very senior leaders who none of them would be people of color to actually address systemic racism. So if you can just imagine for a minute how hard that is, being a woman of color and stepping into only 15 minutes with a board, often that gets whittled down to probably 10, to pitch and address an investment in addressing racism. Very hard to do. Nobody has an understanding of the problem at hand. I've got to paint the problem, I've got to paint the risk, and I've got to ask for the money on behalf of a workforce that is likely, on most workforces, likely we see 15 to 24% of people of color in that workforce, in large public and private sector workforces. So it's not an insignificant amount, it's pretty significant. And usually I have about less than 15 minutes to pitch it. So in terms of challenge, there's definitely challenge in that. How I've addressed it is I've addressed it from a very evidence-based approach, and I've addressed it from a humanity and a risk approach. And I put the onus back on the leader with power from a human decency perspective to act and act now. And if they don't, it's a personal legacy to not have acted in that moment. And sometimes I will say that I've presented the case for change based on risk and racism that actually exists. So often we do some qualitative interviewing before we get to the board. So we actually know that people in their workforce actually do experience racism. But I will say that I have been turned down many a time to delay that decision to do anything. So it's not seen as significant enough problem to address. And that's a huge challenge, because I have to walk away. And for me, I take it quite personally. I can't say that I'm thick-skinned enough to walk away from that and not feel that sense of failure that I've engaged with people who've told me their lived experiences, but I can't get it over the line. And I can't get an investment. I've got a delayed decision. And often in those moments, I hope that I have the sort of that collegial support from the chief people officer, the head of diversity and inclusion. I can recount many a times where there's a lot of support and agreement behind the scenes, but once a CEO or a managing director takes a certain stance in that 15 minutes, you'll see that those chief people officers won't go against their CEO in that moment. They will back down, and I become the lone ranger fighter in that moment. And it's easy to shoot down an external voice like me because I'm not internal, right? So it's easy to dismiss and discount someone like me. So those are tough times, and it means that I got to go fight even harder to get back in there to a client like that. But it has happened for sure. Yeah.
Now, Mind Tribes focuses on both individual empowerment and organizational metrics.
Mhm.
What's one transformational story that really stands out to you?
Transformational story, both from an individual or organizational perspective. Which one?
Either or.
Either or. There's so many transformational stories. So we actually, you talked or asked earlier about career life stages. We're very particular about understanding career life stages because age as an intersection of race and gender is a very interesting identity demographic to look at. Because when we do that workforce composition analysis, and if we cut the data by age, we can see Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-European women's trajectory compared to women of color trajectories in their career life cycle, so where they are level-wise in a business. And if we cut that by age, we actually can see the huge disadvantage that happens for women of color. So likely what we find is, or most likely what we find is that there's a massive differential. So a woman in her 40s who's a woman of color compared to an Anglo-Saxon woman who's far more senior, and that woman of color will likely be sort of middle line leadership, not even in senior leadership, which actually is an economic gap, because what she earns at 40 as a manager or senior manager compared to an executive director, general manager, head of who's 40, there's a massive differential there. And so there's economic advantage, there's super fund advantage, more super funds available. And we know that if you had on average a 30 to 40-year working career as a woman, let alone a woman of color, we know that women of color will have to likely work longer or have some sort of other form of income well into their 70s or mid 70s, which is not a good story. So I just will say, in context of that, what we've done successfully with a lot of women is support them to find senior sponsors for their careers. And there's so many stories. I mean, we've got thousands of women who've been through our career management masterclasses. So it's hard to pick, Gertrude, about who I could pick. But I'd say is we've had about 83% of more than 1,000 women who have found the right sponsor, who have accelerated their leadership careers or actually stepped into board roles or C-suite roles, which is fabulous to see. And everybody has advanced. So some of them have advanced from a low base. So they were middle managers, then stepping into senior executive, those who were senior executives stepping into C-suite roles. So we've seen that happen. But the power of a sponsor to open the door rather than a mentor who's behind the door and just helping you behind the door, someone actually turning the knob and opening that door has been a very powerful thing. And more so, I'd say the capability build of sponsors has helped us do that, because it's not the onus of that woman of color to develop sponsor capability. So when we've done that, we've seen transformational change because we can't wait for an organization to change who they promote and how they promote, but we can actually have an advocate at the table influencing change and backing, someone like you or me into that executive table. So that's worked a lot. So I'm pretty proud of that. Yeah.
So how does cultural exclusion impact mental health, particularly for women from linguistically and culturally diverse backgrounds?
We've done a study which you can access on our website. All of our research is free. So we have a partnership with the University of Melbourne, and we've produced our own research since 2016. Again, something that I would love people to engage with because we make it free. So if you go to Mind Tribes and Reports, you can find all of our reports. I'll do a little spotlight. We're doing a Men of Color report. So I know it's her story, but his story
Yes.
is also very important. When you think
Yes.
about dual career couples as well, so migrant couples, and what it means for their household income and career trajectory. So hop on our website, check out our research. But one of our pieces of research that talks to your question about mental health is we did a study. This was a public sector study, though, for women of color safety at work. And we found that 1 in 3 women of color did not feel safe in the public sector. 1 in 2 First Nations women did not feel safe, culturally safe. And that means that, when it came to their cultural identity and sharing their background, their different experiences, lived experiences, language, faith, religion, they had to hide or mask or cover that, because the more they exposed that, the more negative backlash they experience because of showing their identity. So when we discovered that startling statistic from that first piece of research, we actually did a secondary piece of research to understand, well, if you experience this level of culturally unsafe experiences, then what did you do? And we got even more shocked by the next reveal of the next piece of data. 76% of women of color said they would experience racism and sexism quite regularly, and they would not report it because they felt that no one would believe them. They could not trust the system. They felt that actually they would be treated quite differently and quite harshly if they had to speak up. And then because of that, we asked them, I went again quite hungry after the research. I asked for more money to say, well, I want to understand the mental health impact of that. So if you experience racism and sexism, you cannot report it because you fear the backlash. Then what happens to you? What happens inside your brain? What happens to your relationships? What happens after that? And a lot of women shared very vulnerably with us. I did about 60 plus deep interviews and a questionnaire as well. And we found very high rates of anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, chronic fatigue. So like 68% of women said, I'm so tired. About 58% said, I just stopped trying to advance my career. I just stopped. I just had no energy or low confidence in myself to try and even go for an internal secondment. I just stopped trying. I'm just very transactional. Work is work. And these are very talented, ambitious women. It's not that they're not ambitious, they're not talented, they're giving up. The system has failed them and they're giving up. So it's quite serious in terms of mental health.
Wow. That is so sad. Now, let's end our interview with 2 questions, which are a bit of a time experiment. In the first question, I'm going to teleport you back to go and have a conversation with the younger you, the young woman who went into the world of diversity and inclusion, wanting to make a difference. Just in case there is a DEI practitioner who's listening to this interview right now, we see what's going on in the United States around DEI, the impact it's having around the world. If you could go back and give her 3 nuggets of wisdom, based on what life has taught you up until this point, what 3 nuggets of wisdom would you have given your younger self when you were starting on this journey?
Ooh, very good. First, go with evidence. So I'd say advice to my younger self is go find the evidence so that you are talking from a place of knowing, that it's not a personal rhetoric, because I do find, especially people of color who are in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, it's easy to dismiss us because people feel we're talking only from our lived experience. So I had to make sure that I had strong evidence behind me. Second, I'd say go after system change. It's more scalable in terms of impact and longevity and sustainability than going after individual change. And I learned this from starting up a social enterprise and trying to help women one by one. But I changed my energy and focused more on the system. And the third, I'd say, is find very, very senior people who are part of your senior squad of allies, people who can influence with you, because your voice alone, it can get quite tiresome and you can get fatigued. And I've had to work very hard to build a senior level stakeholder group. And now I have, commissioners. We work with the Human Rights Commissioner, the Victoria Multicultural Commissioner, the Race Commissioner, Fair Work Commissioner, all the ministers, senior private sector CEOs and boards. When you have those people around you who are values aligned and who can amplify your message, it makes all the difference. Otherwise, your voice can get quite tired and quite lonely. And I myself didn't have access to those rooms and conversations and networks, so I had to build it by stealth. It's almost 15 years, so it's been a while. But I'd say those are the things that I wish I had earlier.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now, if I teleport you into the future to go and meet the older you this time, and she's 90 years old, sitting in her rocking chair, surrounded by her children, her grandchildren, maybe you're on a dance floor dancing, who knows?
I hope so.
If we could teleport you into the future to meet this wise woman who has done all this work all her life, impacted on thousands of communities, what will you say to the older you when you finally meet her?
I'd say rest and rest well. I think I would love to give myself this message now as I approach 50. So I'm approaching 50 and I'm tired already. And I wish that I could tell my self today what I would hope to tell my 90-year-old self is actually pace yourself. And I hope at 90 I can rest and rest easy, and that I've made enough legacy and enough pathways for others that they continue the work. So I hope I rest easy. My dad taught me this very valuable fact that, you've got to put your head on your pillow at night and just know that you've done the best you possibly can as a human being. And if you're resting uneasy, it means you haven't done your best. So go back again tomorrow and try harder. So I've taken that life lesson from my dad. And I think sometimes I've got to rewind a little bit. I go way too fast and I've got to slow down. So hopefully by 90, I'm slowed down, Gertrude. I hope to God that I am. And my 3 children take that legacy and do something good with it.
Thank you so much, Div, and thank you for your work. Like I said, your work is needed right now. The world is changing. There's been a major, major shift in the United States that has a ripple effect on all of us wherever we are in the world. So keep up the good fight. Thank you so much for coming online and sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much for the invite.
And thank you to everybody who tuned in today. The Her Story Circle is not just a podcast. We are a social impact movement that brings you the stories and voices of women from all over the world. We share our stories to uplift you, inspire you, energize you, but most importantly, to help take you from where you are now to where you're trying to go. So tune in again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And Div, thanks again for the interview. Bye for now, everybody. And that's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty